Isaiah chapter 29, and we had gotten down to verse 3, but kind of as a brief refreshing, ignore the colors, but it's a section of a summary of woes to Ariel. Ariel is, whether you take it as some, the lion of God, others, the hearth or the altar of God. It is representative of Jerusalem, and so it is a woe to Jerusalem that he's going to distress them. Okay, Dale? Words mean different things, depending on context usually. I guess a good illustration, go back to Joshua chapter 6, and the Israelites, as they took Jericho, were not allowed to take what? The accursed things. That word also means devoted. What's the connection between the two? Accursed and devoted? Well, the word can mean either one depending on context. Ariel, it really, since this is the only place really where the word is mentioned in this section, there's not much to, as we might say, go on as to how to define it. And so you go back into a study then of the etymology and how it came about, which is beyond my knowledge on most words. I don't study that generally. But basically it comes to the point where some will say one thing, others will say something else. Well, that's what you have with this word. Some say it means lion of God. Others believe it means hearth of God or altar of God. So it could be, and as you mentioned, both of them certainly are biblical ideas. So as I go through, and as we went through this last week, I tend more toward the idea of altar of God, but it might be either one. Bill, you want to say?
Yeah, and it defines it also as the city where David dwelt.
Right. So it's being used in a figurative way to to represent Jerusalem. Now then the question is, in that regard, the meaning of the word, yes, it has reference to Jerusalem. We all know that. But as a symbol is representing something, so Ariel is representing an idea. Is it an idea of an altar of God, or is it an idea of the lion of God? Israel was at one time the lion of God in that sense. As they were God's representative, he protected them. He fought for them, and those type of ideas. And they were now going to be brought low. If it deals with the altar of God, then you're dealing with, this is the place where sacrifices were made to God. And those things are going to, excuse me, well, those things are going to cease. They're going to come to an end. So, I say it represents one or the other ideas. It could be either one. Both of them are consistent with what we would find in the Bible, and both of them are consistent with what we would find in the text here. So that brings us to verse 3. And I will camp against thee round about, and will lay a siege against thee with a mount, and I will raise forts against thee. God, through his instrument, the Assyrians, is going to besiege the city of, this would be at 701 BC. Okay, Dale?
Is forts like that thing that has soldiers behind it that's attacking the city, including a battering ram, or is it totally a different kind of shooting?
Wait until I get there.
Okay.
If you will, though, notice, and first, actually, you need to go back to verse 2, that there's an emphasis that God is the one doing this. In verse 2, I will distress. Then in verse 3, I will camp. And then later on, I will raise forts against. So, in these two verses, God 3 times emphasizes he's the one doing it. The siege, that he would lay the siege against thee, was the way in which God was going to oppress the city. There was going to be a siege that takes place. I thought it was interesting. I'm not sure that I agree with this, but Young in his commentary states the language in which the description is couched makes clear that the Lord is speaking of a spiritual, not a literal oppression. One of the big problems I have with that is that it was a literal oppression. Now then, was there a spiritual aspect to it? Certainly there was, because God was doing this from the standpoint they had transgressed his will. So there is that spiritual aspect to it, but it is a literal oppression. They were literally encircled by the Assyrian army. God had revealed that he would use the Assyrians against Zion. Someone turn back to Isaiah chapter 10. And if you would read verses 5 through 12. Isaiah chapter 10, verses 5 through 12. through verse 12.
As I have done to Samaria and her idols, shall I not do also to Jerusalem and her idols? Therefore, it shall come to pass, when the Lord has performed all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, that he will say, I will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the glory of his haughty looks.
Okay, he begins with Assyria. It's Assyria that's doing this. And he brings out not only the northern kingdom of Samaria and the city of Samaria, but then he includes Jerusalem in this as well, that he's going to do this to Jerusalem, as he has done unto Samaria. And then he ends it with talking about the king of Assyria again. So he's already set forth very clearly it's Assyria that's going to be doing this. But as we see in this, it is God doing it using the instrument of the Assyrians. And then, as we read at the end of that, or Pam read at the end of that section in Isaiah 10, 5 through 12, God is going to punish the king of Assyria. Look over to Habakkuk 5, or Habakkuk chapter 1, and verses 5 through 11. Habakkuk 1, 5 through 11. Somebody want to read that? If you're there. Okay. Here, he's going to raise up the Chaldeans. Who are the Chaldeans? Come on. Try. It's the Babylonians, or the Chaldeans, and thus specifically Nebuchadnezzar in this case. But he's going to use the Chaldeans or the Babylonians against the Assyrians to destroy them. That's what Habakkuk is speaking about. And he says he would lay siege against thee with a mount. Reason I showed this before, King James has with a mound, or New King James, while the American Standard has with posted troops. Seems like quite a change there. the word has reference apparently to a firing platform. And that soldiers would be posted around the city to prevent access in or out of it. Basically, you're talking about encircling the city with your troops. So there's no way to get in or out. And if you remember back in those days, a lot of times the cities were fortified. There were walls on the city. And so they would build platforms to hurl rocks or objects into the or at the walls and knock the walls down. So that's the kind of the idea that he's talking about with a mount or with a mound. But the idea of posted troops would be that they had encircled the city with the troops. You would have that as well. Isn't that how we got Trojan horse? Because of that very idea they built a big Trojan horse and hid inside of it, rolled it up, or actually they didn't. Left it out there and they went and pulled it into the city. And they entered the city that way. City of Troy, yeah. I will raise forts. Again, if we go to the New King James and the American Standard, I will raise siege works. It would again be the encirclement of the city by the Assyrian army. And so all of it is dealing with, here's the Assyrian army coming to Jerusalem. They encircle the city with their armies and are going to lay siege to it and getting prepared to do the battle. So in verse 4, and thou shalt be brought down, and shall speak out of the ground, and thy speech shall be low out of the dust, and thy voice shall be as of one that hath familiar spirit out of the ground, and thy speech shall whisper out of the dust. This is speaking about Ariel again, or Jerusalem. It has been brought low from its lofty or elevated position. Jerusalem was greatly elevated by God, wasn't it? Think of the times during David and how that those who fought against David and Israel were destroyed. Jerusalem was an elevated city. Think of the riches of Solomon. Caused the Queen of Sheba to say what? The half has yet not been told, or yet been told. That she had heard of his riches, so came from afar to see about it, not believing it. And it says half of it hadn't even been told. He was so rich. Now, gold is a precious commodity. I don't know what it sells for per ounce nowadays. I think about the last time I looked, it seemed like it was something over $2,000 an ounce. expensive. Think of building the temple and everything is overlaid with gold. That's a lot of gold. So they were very lofty, elevated position. Of course, they thought even more so of themselves than probably they should have, because they were God's chosen people, weren't they? God was their God. He was a special God to them, and they were a special people to Him. That's one of the problems that all of the prophets faced in reality, and trying to get through to the people that you need to repent. God's going to destroy. He's not going to destroy us. We're God's chosen people. He would never let anything happen to us. Well, that became a problem for the...
They didn't remember the judges, what happened back then. Most people did. And they have history reminders back then too, probably. Just you understand.
They, and a lot like today, ignored history and used it conveniently for their advantage. When they were in subjection to Rome, you remember them saying, "We've never been in subjection to anyone. We've never been in bondage to anyone." They were in bondage to Rome right then. We've never been. Now, how do you explain that? Other than their arrogance, and they're using, if you want to call it history, even the present time at that time, for looking at it through their rose-colored glasses, as we might put it. So they were, God is saying, I'm going to bring you low. From its state of humility now, being brought low or brought down, they're going to speak from out of the ground. Does that mean they're going to be below the ground or be buried or something? Well, no. Their speech is literally a whisper. Literally, it is a chirp or a peep. In Isaiah 8 and verse 19, it says, "But when they shall say unto you, seek unto them that have familiar spirits, and unto wizards that peep, that mutter, should not a people seek unto their God, for the living to the dead?" Homer Haley described it this way: "They will speak out of the ground, low out of the dust, gasping like a dying person, or chirping like one with a familiar spirit." The familiar spirit, by the way, is what's used here. He goes on to say, "The latter is a medium who claims to summon and consult with the dead. Mediums deceive their clients by speaking in a weak, thin voice, or sometimes by ventriloquism, as though the words came from the ground. Jerusalem will be brought so very low that her speech will be a whimper." And so he's talking about somebody, they're so low and it's very mysterious. that's the way Israel is going to be speaking, because God has brought them so low to the ground, they're like a dying person almost. Or like a person who's trying to deceive you by a weak speech, and that they've raised someone from the dead, or they're getting a message from the dead. Well, that's what God is describing here of Israel. The Assyrians, led by Sennacherib's siege, however, did not bring the people that low. Remember what happened? They go to bed one night, and 185,000 of them wake up the next morning dead. A little play on words there, but 185,000 of them are dead. And Assyria returns back, goes back home. So Sennacherib's siege did not bring them that low, did it? The Babylonians, led by Nebuchadnezzar, captured and destroyed the city. That would have been initially at 606 BC. Then there's a second wave of captivity in 597 BC. And then finally the destruction of the city in 586 BC. So he did not only just capture the city, he destroyed the city at 586. That was followed, though, by the Persian or Medo-Persian rule. During that time, the Medo-Persian Empire, they were allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the city, rebuild the temple, rebuild the walls of the city. After the Medo-Persian rule, you had an affliction by the Seleucids of Syria. And this is during that 400-year period between Malachi and John the Baptist. You have the Seleucids. And during that period of time, you had the abomination of desolation that was spoken of by Daniel, in which you had their enemy offering a pig upon the altar of God. Now, if you remember, pigs were unclean animals. They were abomination to the Israelites. And yet, in order to humiliate the Israelites, they offered a pig upon the altar of God. So you had that certainly bringing them low again. And during that time you have basically two main kings, one of the north, one of the south, and guess where they met? Basically in Jerusalem or Israel, that area. Finally, there's the humiliation by Rome. Rome, obviously they took over the world as a world empire. I think it was around 60-something BC. And because of Jerusalem's continued rebellion and the hatred for the Jews, finally Rome destroyed Jerusalem. That would have been in AD 70. By the way, Matthew, the 24th chapter, is discussing that destruction. Matthew 24, Actually, it starts in chapter 23 and about verse 36 and goes through 24 and verse 35. And then in verse 36, you have a change to but, with the word but. And then he talks about the second coming. But that destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, all of these, of course, came as a direct result of the wickedness of the people. If Israel had remained faithful to God, none of these oppressions would have ever come about. They never would have been brought low, but they didn't. They did not remain faithful to God. They even lost the book of God that was supposed to be read on a constant basis. They offered or built idols to worship the idols that foreign nations had worshipped, all an affront to God. And so God brought them low. And as being described here, so low that it seems as the voice from under the dust of the ground. A sad conclusion to a people that could have been great. They had every opportunity. They had the advantages that in reality no other nation had. Through all of that Old Testament period of time, there was not another nation that had the advantages of Israel. And they squandered it. Making an application, look at the blessings that we have as Christians in the church. We have wonderful opportunities and wonderful blessings, and yet how many people squander it? I'm sure every one of you could just go down a list of people, no telling how long, of people who have left the church totally, gone back into the world, living like the world. How many members of the church are living like the world even though they attend regularly and are considered faithful Christians? You know what a faithful Christian is, don't you? It's someone who attends all the services. That's how we use faithful Christian. Doesn't matter how he lives, what he does in his life. If he's here, Sunday morning, for us Sunday afternoon, Wednesday night, then he's a faithful Christian. Well, we need to reconsider our thinking along that line many times, but we've got all of these advantages. Lest he fall. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 12. Take heed. Be watchful. Be careful. Because even though you think you might be standing, you might be falling. But if you think of the blessings of Christianity, Watch what happens when something happens to someone, and then they try and get all of the religious people. They might not even believe in God almost. They never darken any religious group's building. They care nothing about the Bible, nothing about God, but something happens in their family. Oh, we want you to pray for us. And they will start praying. Their prayers don't get past the sound of their voice. God doesn't hear them. Person in a denomination, God doesn't hear their prayer. They're rejected because they're not a righteous man. God hears the prayers of the righteous, not the unrighteous. What a wonderful opportunity we have to go before our God in prayer. It's Christians who have hope. And we could just go through a lot of the things that we as Christians are blessed with. And yet, just like Israel of old, we squander them so many times because we will not remain truly faithful to God. And I'm using faithful now in the sense of a biblical aspect, person who remains in obedience and to God and glorifies God within their life. We'll start with verse 5 then, Lord willing, next week.